Thanks, Bertrand. That's great. Probably the sound that doesn't work. But okay, so I'm sorry for this delay. I will curb my talk by this amount of minutes. But anyway, so my plan is this. I will talk in the first 10 minutes. I will talk about the general memory in humans, at the single neuron level. Then I'll talk about enhancement during waking, and then I'll talk about an enhancement or modulation of memory during sleep. Okay, so essentially, putting it in a social context, I think we are facing what I said in the beginning, a cognitive calamity, essentially, where we're going to have millions and millions of people walking around with memory impairment, with the increase in the aging population, and with the prevalence of diseases such as Alzheimer's disease in particular. So there is obviously a certain boost in the attempt to really understand the memory system and the brain in general, from the single neuron of the most simple of animals. At the same time, as we have seen here, we have very detailed, nice, controlled paradigms that we can do with rodents, with humans, of course. The situation is different, so we cannot really work in sequence. And what I will present is a setting that Yuval already alluded to, and let's see. And that is the setting of epilepsy patients who are being monitored. This is a subset of patients with very severe epilepsy who are being monitored on a special unit with electrodes which are placed in the brain in suspected regions for epilepsy. So it's really a rare opportunity. The patients are awake for a period of 1 to 2 weeks, and they have electrodes in the brain which are implanted for clinical reasons, not for science, of course. These are special electrodes that we have, which also have the capability of recording at the level of single neurons as well. So here's an opportunity. You look at single neurons, you look at an awake and sleeping patients who can, at least in the awake period, report what they remember and what they conceive at those particular moments in our experimental design. Because they are waiting to have seizures, they usually welcome this type of distractions, especially if we use paradigms which are not boring, okay? So we're trying to keep them entertained while at the same time learn something about the brain. But you can see here, essentially in the end of this, let's see, do we have a laser pointer here? Yeah, this should, I guess, work. Yeah, so you can see here, those microwires are really capable of getting single neurons, and those macro contacts here in the brain, they're capable of sensing EEG and providing stimulation or micro stimulation. It's a very rare situation that we can take advantage of. So basically, in the system that we will look at, both in the awake and in the sleep state, is really that highly complex system that you can see on the left, that shows you the visual system. And here on the left side, you can really see the flow of information, from association cortex into the hippocampus through that area called the entorhinal cortex. And here really is this magnificent transformation, meaning simply that everything that you listen to or see or perceive or experience will undergo some kind of magical transformation, so that in the future, hopefully at any particular time, you will be able to consciously recollect that experience. So that there is obviously a initial period of encoding when you are exposed to the experience, but later the idea, of course, that there is a dialogue between cortex and this hippocampal system, what is known as the Entorhinal-Hippocampal system, and it interacts so that information This laser is out of battery. But so that information flows essentially in both directions, not only into the hippocampus, but also out of the hippocampus in what is known, in the nice words of hippocampal neocortical dialogue. Okay, so that's what we have been hearing. That's one of the main themes. This is the memory hub of the brain. So you know just what Michael Zugarol, what he told us, but very briefly, you know, this idea of trying to pair humans with rodents, the identification of these particular sets of cells, the place cells that Michael talked about, and then the grid cells, which are cells in entorhinal cortex, which the Mosers have discovered, which actually fire not in a particular place in the environment, but in a repetitive pattern across the environment, so that they essentially create a hexagonal symmetry of 60 degrees, so that each point of activation in the grid is really connected to 6 points. And why there is, you know, 6 hexagonal symmetry in a two-dimensional world that we live in, essentially climbing and going up and down surfaces, you know, there can be several theories about it, but it's pretty much a magical finding. So we have been struggling with this, and just to bring it to a common denominator, this idea of having the same kind of system in humans and rodents, we basically confirmed it later in several papers, briefly using this type of navigational situation. Being a taxi driver, we showed that there were really place cells in a paper, you know, long time ago by Ekstrom et al. And then 10 years later, it took us 10 more years to really show in this type of virtual environment where you are driving some kind of a vehicle and exploring the environment, that there is really also this type of grid-like symmetry in the entorhinal cortex in the human brain. So we were relieved to see that there is really some parallels. You know, it was followed by several other, you know, works that we did. One with Jacobs, where we showed that initial finding, but also showing repetitive spatial activation in entorhinal cortex in a circular maze. So all this is just to show that there is some parallel between rodents and human. You know, as we advance, you know, in this session here from rodents to human, and trying to see, you know, what is common and what can be extended. I should also say that in addition to the issue of firing rate, which we're always concerned about as a major measure of neuronal function, we also have a phase element or a temporal element of when will the neuron fire in the cycle, you know, which is measured in the brain. The timing cycles are the oscillation, the native oscillation in the brain. You have heard about some of those. You know, one is a theta, which is very prevalent in hippocampus. The other is of course, those slow waves, which we see in slow wave sleep, which in some sense you can look at them as a clock for neuronal firing. For instance, in that paper up there, you can see the theta cycle. And in this paper, it was shown that when the neurons fire at a certain phase of the theta, the items which are seen at that time will be remembered better. So this idea of timing of firing, you know, is quite strong. Now, we have all these new opportunities to study people during waking and sleep cycles now, because we are also implanting, you know, in this day and age, we are implanting neuroprosthetic devices in brains of patients. And this is like the first FDA-approved the device, which is a closed loop, meaning it can both sense the activity in the brain and then stimulate and act on this sensing. This is known as an RNS, responsive neurostimulation, and it's implanted for specific goal to actually identify seizure activity and then activate and actuate stimulation at the same time, okay? So Essentially, this can be also used and has been used by my colleague Nancy Susanna and Zara Adjian in his paper in Current Biology to show that in a freely moving patient, because now you have somebody who is implanted like instead of a cardiac pacemaker, with a neural or brain pacemaker, and they are working with it 24 hours a day, 365 days. This is an opportunity to really see neural function in action all the time, sleep and waking, And here we have shown really that the theta cycle that Michael was talking about and other people does really exist. It may not exist as such in bats, but it does exist in human in short bouts. And then you can see that here, you can see that there's 6 examples from 8 patients. In fact, the best patient who gave us, theta cycle, which was with the longest bouts of theta, was a blind patient, actually, that was working, without visual cues. It was working with other sensory cues, which is cane, but he had this perfect rodent-like theta. So initially, they thought that humans may have a lower theta, but actually they do have a major component of a rodent-like theta. So this was good in the sense that we thought that we could use this system and use all the knowledge that has been gained in the rodent world in this paper, moving now to neuromodulation. So the 10 minutes are almost over, and we're moving to neuromodulation in this paper, showing that stimulation during awake time now in this area of entorhinal cortex, and I'll show you that, does promote a spatial navigation memory. So patients who were actually navigating in this city, they were told to bring things to various stores. They were doing it several times, half of the stores with stimulation, half without, and they ended up really showing that when you stimulate during navigation to a particular location, you will later be able to navigate better to this location if you're stimulated in a certain place in this Entorhinal-Hippocampal system, okay? So, and in fact, it's not the hippocampus itself, but the gateway to the hippocampus, okay? And I won't bore you with those things, with those graphs, just saying that the hippocampus itself, this type of stimulation did not work, but it did work in the gateway into the hippocampus, where essentially there were really differences, as you can see on the right side, between stimulation and non-stimulation, so that when you were stimulated during learning, you were later going straight to the target without really getting all this excess mileage that people who can't find their way need to. Of course, now, I mean, this is almost obsolete knowledge because all our hippocampal system and entorhinal system are all now in the process of atrophy because we have delegated this function to various programs in our car. And what we know now is only a linear set of instructions: turn right, turn left, go straight, or take the second exit. So we moved, from a natural, spatial environment to a totally linear environment. So don't trust your hippocampus anymore. This is one of the messages, okay? In any case, so, we're probably modulating the oscillatory pattern. I won't go over that too much, but just moving and saying that, of course, we are not only spatial navigators, we are also dealing with visual information all the time. And one of the things which we have seen in a long set of studies, there is an example here from a paper, in fact, with Yuval, you can see it here on the right, with Dr. Nir, as a first author who had fantastic examples of cells which were responding to particular images, to particular individual, or to particular class of individuals. So this type of high specificity we will want to pay attention to. And you can see here, a cell in C, which is responsive to the Twin Towers. You can see a cell which will respond to a particular actor. You can see a cell on the bottom right which responds to the Eiffel Tower, being right here. So was a good example, Yuval. I guess you put it in natural medicine because of that. And so this type of very specific responses are very prevalent in the hippocampus system, but more importantly, this system, sorry about that, let's see if we can move back. Yeah, no? Having a... Yeah. So these responses also have a very unique property of being able to generalize, meaning that for instance, in this example, you can see that although this cell is highly responsive to a character from Luke Skywalker, you can see that they respond also to the iconic words and to the sound even. So it doesn't really care. The cell is able to abstract at this level. So this is the hippocampal level where we are getting rid of the sensory qualities, and we're just getting what sometimes is called the gist of the experience or the stimulus itself. So it's a very interesting property, and now if we are going to try and follow this type of cells during sleep, we may have a marker of specificity. So theoretically, at least, because we have not proven it yet, and it's a major challenge to follow such a cell, which we call a concept cell, during the sleep and see if there is really repetitive replay of this type of activity. I mean, here you can see this idea of having a concept cell. You will identify in 200 milliseconds that this is Einstein. You don't care that this is really in black and white or color or written. That type of abstraction exists in your brain because this input goes this process of abstraction as you approach the top of the hierarchy, and a series of papers that show that this is a very special code that we have for cells. So these are not place cells, but these are actually concept cells, and we have transformed the Euclidean space into a conceptual n-dimensional space, essentially using perhaps the same architecture that was in evolution placed initially for navigation in space. So it does make sort of philosophical sense that we're using the same tools, but we're using it in a different way, perhaps in a more elaborate way. So this idea of having essentially a replay or reactivation, I would say, during the waking state does exist, and we have dramatically shown it because we have actually presented episodes, and you cannot actually see the sound here, but as this cursor moves, you will see that during various episodes, the cell is completely silent, okay, and when you actually get to a certain particular episode, you get suddenly firing of the cell. We don't have sound, so you cannot hear the actual firing rate, but this is a scene from Seinfeld, and whenever every scene that you get from Seinfeld, this cell is firing, and it doesn't fire to dozens of other stimuli, okay? So now the question is, and this happens repetitively whenever the sensory world exists there in that particular fashion. So next you will see, a episode from, this time also Seinfeld, but you will have a different episode of Kramer, and basically the cell will fire very selectively, but in that very abstract fashion and in continuous fashion. Now what's interesting is now when there is actually attempts to memorize this, and the patient now recalls what she has seen, you will see that as we move on, now there is nothing in the world. Now, she's not dreaming, she's not sleeping, she's awake, but there is essentially a replay of this type of activity by this cell. It's not a play cell, it's a concept cell, but now, she's saying everything that she remembers, the cell started firing, and now, as she recalls the entire experience, yes, there were 3 of them and all that, the cell is continue to be active, and there is essentially, if you would want to use the same word, a replay, which is done, of course, associated with the conscious experience and associated with the recall, but actually activated before the actual conscious experience of the recall itself, okay? So this type of system, can be manipulated also in terms of stimuli which are not only spatial, but involve actually faces and other stimuli. And in this study, I'm just showing you this very complex system. But what we have shown here, because I don't want to get too much into detail, is that stimulation at a very particular point, on this MRI, but actually it's a white matter which leads into this wonderful system. When you stimulate there, even microstimulate with 50 microampere, which is very, very small amount of current, you can actually improve discrimination of faces. They do much better with stimulation in terms of identifying what they have seen and discriminating it from a lure, meaning that they are more accurate and they remember better. So what we require essentially and what we achieve, and you can see it in the purple, what we achieve is a better performance in actually recognizing the right stimulus, but also rejecting anything which is similar to it. So this is really the definition of specificity of memory. You don't only have a general memory, but you have a very specific memory. So this is published in eLife. And so this kind of gives you the background. In a series of various tests, we have shown that the critical thing to do is stimulate in the white matter, probably because it's more physiological stimulus of fibers which go into a certain region. So this principle we have kept also when we try to attack the basic topic of this conference. So again, look at this diagram on the right, on the left side, and where we have stimulated is right in this arrow, which goes from entorhinal cortex into the hippocampus, into the fields of the hippocampus, okay? Into CA3 netted gyrus of the hippocampus. But of course, we have not affected the way back, which is critical in the dialogue during sleep, right? So that moves us into this diagram, just to go again over those three major oscillatory phenomena that we can see during slow wave sleep. One is slow oscillation that we talked about. Second is a spindle. And third, of course, what we have heard about is sharp wave ripple phenomena that we heard about in the previous session, okay? And the idea, again, I'm using, this very diagram that you have used, because I think it's a very nice one, right, from this review, and you will recognize it right here, right? Because this really gives you a very nice depiction of all, these three types of oscillatory phenomena. Now, for us, identifying the ripples is a major challenge. I mean, Michael, for him, it's easy. He knows that, and he has full control. So we have initially, when we try to interfere, we concentrated really on the slow oscillation. But we are relying on the basic work which Yuval did in his postdoctoral work, which he did with Tononi and with us, which was done, a few years ago. Most of the work and the most, I think probably the most important paper is the one from 2011 in Neuron, which really set out, the basic observation that indeed, looking at our patient when they were sleeping with this type of electrodes, we could see, obviously, and measure surface EEG. We could measure the intracranial local field potential, and we could measure the activity of single neurons at the same time, okay? It was a rare opportunity, and indeed, what Yuval has seen, he has seen what is already known, but was important to confirm it in humans. He has seen these off and on states that you can see on the scalp, you can see in the depth with an opposite phase, and you could see, in the off phase, in the slow wave sleep, you could see that shutdown, very dramatic shutdown of the neurons. So there's very strong phenomena which happens here, okay? So this, one of the important finding was really that this type of oscillatory phenomena, the slow wave and the spindles here, were actually often a local phenomena, meaning they were seen in some of the electrodes and were not seen in other. This sort of corroborated Tononi's concept of a local sleep, that sleep may be a regional phenomena. It's important because if you don't have, slow wave in a certain region, you won't be able to use that essentially to drive stimulation. Moreover, what was shown at the time, that there is a slow wave propagation from frontal lobe to medial temporal lobe and hippocampus, meaning that if you try to lock on the phase, you need to know where you are at least, okay? You're not necessarily at a particular location, at a particular phase, okay? So then, we essentially, and of course this shows you also that the spindles were also site-specific and did not appear in all the electrodes. But I think this was an important insight in what should be done. At least two of the hallmarks, slow wave and sleep spindles, occur mostly locally, and they propagate in the way that I have described to you, okay? From frontal lobe to medial temporal lobe and hippocampus. Maybe it's the opposite way in which it propagates when you intake information. Now, taking it just a little aside, I will summarize in one slide what has been done over maybe dozens of papers, some of those very important work of doing non-invasive stimulation. Some of it is summarized by Russian-born, but essentially the paradigm is similar. You're using either transcortical, direct cortical stimulation, or direct current stimulation, or alternating current stimulation, or sometimes you do a short-term repetitive stimulation, electrical stimulation, short duration repetitive electrical stimulation, as shown in a recent paper, is also effective, and of course transcortical magnetic stimulation. Some of those papers are better than others, and sometimes I'm worried that people will go home and they buy a battery and will try and do experiment on themselves, and there are probably some vendors outside who are selling this thing for gaming, etc. Okay, but the problem, of course, with scalp stimulation is to what extent, are you really targeting a particular circuit, or are you really working on some kind of a global phenomena? So to look at this, we actually launched on a project which was led by a postdoc, Maya Geva Sagiv, who was graduate, of the Weizmann Institute, and then went to Tel Aviv University and UCLA. Together with Yuval, we launched this very ambitious attempt to really interfere with memory or modulate memory during sleep. That's because I felt that during sleep you have a captive audience. It is indeed the most reasonable place to intervene, because you got a lot of control, and you're not dealing with a constantly changing world in the waking situation, where you cannot really separate encoding from consolidation, from retrieval. It's all mixed. Here you have a situation where you are mainly dealing with consolidation. So that was an opportunity to interfere. And here, there was the task which was given just before going to sleep. There was a certain manipulation which was done, and then there was testing in the morning. But the critical technical challenge was to really build a closed loop system, that because we believe that you have to stimulate locked to the oscillatory phenomena, first slow wave, and best, of course, ripples. But we started with a slow wave, with the on stage, or the beginning of the on stage, where we know it was also a period ripe with ripples. So indirectly, we thought that we will affect the system. And indeed, so you have the sleeping patient, and you have this particular paradigm where you sense in the hippocampus, and you stimulate in frontal lobe. It was what Maya built. She built a closed loop system that worked in this way during the night and was in fact using epochs of stimulation, 5-minute on, 5-minute off, essentially, and in this type of repetitive stimulation, you can see that she was able to actually stimulate more or less, around a certain phase of the slow wave. And that was pretty consistent, so the closed loop, technically, it indeed worked, okay? And what was really interesting, and I should say that of course we were inspired by Michael's work, Zugaro and other people that indicated that maybe this is a way to go, and stimulation might have a wide effects on the entire brain. And then really using this type of brief pulses of stimulation, which are locked to this, we got a major change, enhancement in slow wave activity, essentially all over the brain in distant sites, and sometimes in the opposite hemisphere. I don't have time to go over that, but you can see that you got a boost, in this little shoulder of slow wave when you stimulate, for instance, in this case, n equal 4, the 4 subject, when you stimulate it in frontal lobe, you see here on the right hemisphere, on the top right, you got changes both in the temporal lobe on this side and in the frontal lobe and in the temporal lobe on the other side, several miles away from where you had a very brief, train of pulses, okay? Now this in itself was quite interesting. You can see that that index, was true for all patients, and in the lower graph, you can see that it actually persisted beyond the period of stimulation, okay? And what was seen, at a single unit level, and this data still needs to be fully analyzed, that you have seen actually is that with stimulation itself, you get locking of the firing of the neurons, to the slow wave. So this type of cortico-hippocampal locking that you get, a firing of neurons all over the brain through the slow waves in the hippocampus, is a major phenomenon that you can achieve with this type of stimulation. And the preliminary results are that in 6 out of the 8 patients, you also got memory improvement, as was tested in the next one. So these are all, preliminary data, but it does point out to the possibility of using this really perhaps in the future in a clinical setting. So I will just touch on one more issue, and the issue of replay. And the replay is an extremely difficult thing to really look at, because if you really wanted to find an episode-specific neuron and then follow it during the night and seeing repetitive sequences, it's technically extremely challenging. So I know several people have been working on this, but a more simple approach, which in itself is very complicated, is in this paper by Zheng, but actually the senior also is Axmacher, which was published in Nature Communication this year. And there they attempted to define essentially replay based on the local field potential around the ripple events. So they try to identify what they call stimulus-specific replay, that is using AI and using several algorithms which they have. They essentially showed that they could identify specific periods just in certain interval after stimulus onset. In fact, 100 to 400 milliseconds, and then 500 milliseconds to 1200 milliseconds. So, and they actually showed that what was associated with memory was actually a replay of that later segment from 500 to 1200. Again, it's not clear why, but this is an example that I was referring in one of my questions in the morning session. We don't fully understand, perhaps what the local field represents. It is just that this is sort of a computational way to define similarity of activity, from sleep to the waking state, but it may be correlated with memory performance. And I'd like to leave you sort of with this general concept of science or science fiction or medicine, in which I am thinking of a memory aid in the same way that you may be thinking about a hearing aid, okay? So, you know, if we are paranoid, we say, well, the government is going to insert memories into our brain, and they're going to eliminate other memories, you know, of the last election or whatever, you know, or what happens, you know, in the Mexico-US border, or, you know, whatever, or with the Yellow Jackets. Those memories may need to be suppressed or enhanced, but essentially just a way to boost the system. And you can do it in two ways. You can just place the system in a better way to encode and consolidate information, as we have done, or we have demonstrated initially, or you can be more ambitious and try, as we have seen with the rodents, to try actually and modulate specific memories, which I think is the ultimate challenge, because this is something that may be able to be used in PTSD and other situations where you want to modulate memory. But the idea is that you have a memory aid, like a hearing aid, like a cochlear implant, which is able to stimulate, to sense, having a good power configuration. You can maybe hide it behind your ear so that nobody will know that you need help with memory. But we are going to have a lot of people running around, you know, very soon and already now, who are just on the, you know, borderline. They cannot function because of memories that may deteriorate at a certain time. So this idea of a memory neuroprosthesis is really out there, and probably sleep is a very reasonable time to actually intervene because of the constancy of the phenomena and maybe the improved control of the stimulation parameters. So I would think I will leave you with that, and we can move to a discussion if we have any time. We'll do it for a few minutes.